good at something, you cannot be taught to be a master at it. So that's point number one. Point number two is the fact that there are no shortcuts to becoming a master at anything. You master something through hard bloody work. And, you know, I get a lot of people who come to me on a daily basis saying, mentor me and make me good. I can't do that. I can tell people about my experience and how I got to where I am, but there are no shortcuts in this game. You learn how to code largely through experimentation. Yeah, you can read the books. They'll give you some fundamentals. They'll give you the basics. It's not going to make you a master. So I want to start back at the beginning, and I'm going to ask Sandra at some point to chime in here as well, because I think Sandra is far more a traditional programmer than I will ever be. I am not what I would ever call a programmer. I am somebody who uses tools to achieve objectives. Now, I want to go back right to the beginning of kind of when I started and tell you guys a little bit of a story about how I ended up where I am. So let's go back all the way to kind of age 11, age 12. I was not a happy child. In fact, I just generally hated everybody. Guess what? Still do, but anyway, irrespective of that. And I discovered that we kind of got a computer at home, and that was not actually a common thing those days. I'd kind of begged and begged and begged my parents, and eventually they bought this computer at home and kind of spent their life savings. And once I got onto it, I was instantly hooked to this machine. It was a machine that if I told it what to do, it did what I told it. Not what it wanted to do, but what I told it. That meant that if I screwed it up and it did something that I didn't intend it to do, it was because I told it to do the wrong thing. Machines don't malfunction, people malfunction. Machines take input and they give you output. It is that simple. It's the same when you look at social engineering and hacking. What are you doing when you're socially engineering, when you're hacking? You are hacking the human brain. You're giving it input to get output. Scary thought, isn't it? I mean, why bother hacking a computer when you can be far more interesting and, you know, hack the human mind? It's far more fun that way. It's called the art of manipulation. But back in those days, I was a 12-year-old kid. My only connection to the net back then, and the net was a very, very different place back then. Keep in mind, Yahoo did not exist. Google did not exist. Facebook did not exist. WhatsApp did not exist. Sandra, what are the other things that didn't exist back in '92? You were around back then.
Everything. We had Gopher.
Yes, it's interesting that the original search mechanism that we used was called Gopher. I think that's very telling, by the way. Go back to your roots. And the only thing that we really had back then was this chat mechanism called IRC, the Internet Relay Chat. That came about in about 1988, I think, Sander? I think it was 88.
Okay. I wasn't big on IRC in the beginning, so I have to defer to you on that one.
Yeah, I think it was about 88, but I got onto IRC in about 92, and back in those days, you had to have some level of clue to get onto IRC. There was no, get this, there was no way for Windows, which back then was Windows 3.0, to connect to the network. It had no network stack. Windows 3.1 didn't actually have a network stack either. You used this funny client thing that you got. That meant that the people who were there had actually really worked to get there. And it was a case of people who were there because they wanted to learn, they wanted to share, and people worked very closely together. It was also a place that did not tolerate fools. There was very, very little time for idiots on IRC back in those days. And when Windows came along, things changed a bit. Suddenly, everybody could get online, and the level of clue online, unfortunately, dropped fairly significantly. But this meant that because of the lack of resource out there, we learned to chase information ourselves through a process of experimentation, a process of banging on doors until people answered us. And it was that learning right down at the low level, because you didn't have these tools where you had a million libraries. You wrote them all yourself. There were no libraries back then. It was a case of here's your stock standard C, and well, there's your C code, and that was about it. And so we learned from the bottom up by playing, by testing, by chasing things that many people would have said, well, that's impossible. That's a good enough reason to chase it, in my view. And I think that if you want to develop from into a really good coder, my first real piece of strong advice to you is forget the boxes they keep putting you in when you study this in a university. When somebody says to you, it has to be done this way because this is best practice, there are some good ideas and there are some bad ideas. I will not deny that. But at the end of the day, what is best practice? Best practice is what works for the job that you are doing. Now, that means that there are no limits. There is no stopping you going out there and experimenting in using your imagination. It is your imagination that limits you when you learn to code. What do I want to achieve? Once I know what I want to achieve, I go after it. And I sit there and I will rewrite the same code sometimes 50 times over. Because each iteration gets better. And it's a time-consuming way to do it. But you learn through that, and there is never a fear of something going wrong. Because what's the worst that you can do? Okay, well, the worst you can do is probably erase your machine, but then you reinstall it. I don't think I've written any code that's done anything really worse than that. Sander, ever done anything worse than kind of erase a machine or two? I don't think so. But the other thing is that this is not about which language you choose. You don't become a master by picking a particular language. You become a master by learning the fundamentals of what are you doing with code? How does a machine work? What is memory? How is memory addressed in the machine, and how can I manipulate it? Because keep in mind, every single line of code that you write is manipulating memory. It's what it's doing. It's changing zeros and ones. That's what the computer thinks. The computer doesn't think in terms of strings. It doesn't think in terms of objects. It doesn't think in terms of go routines. It thinks in terms of zeros and ones. And everything else stacked on top of that is just an abstraction. You don't have to know how to manipulate zeros and ones yourself, but you have to know what the computer's doing. Because if you don't understand what the computer's doing at the back end, you will never master any language. Sander, would you agree with that?
Yeah, so basically a computer is just has a lot of tiny functionalities, like copy some memory, read some input, write some output. And what you're doing as a programmer is imagining, like you said, all those tiny bits and how to put them together in ways that make it do something useful. But if you don't know even know what, like, it's like Lego, you know, you can put it together in a million ways, but you have to know which bits are available before you can imagine what you could build with those bits.
Yeah, exactly. By the way, for the guys who haven't heard of Sander before, I figured that since everybody accuses me of massive Golang bias, I'd invite Sander to this. Sander actually helped write PHP, not write PHP code. He actually was involved in the development of PHP itself. And
Just in very minor ways, but yeah.
and he will also now attest to the fact that Golang is the way to go. Sorry, I just had to add that in there. But
I'm not saying a thing. Oh, I see a question. Which version of PHP? This was actually PHP version 3. I think I did some development between 1997 and 2001, around that time.
So yeah, another
how,
man
how
who's
many
been
people
around a
here
long
have?
time.
How many people here actually write code in PHP? Just curious.
In the chat.
See, I see a couple of people waving. So, what is the I started my involvement in PHP 3 with a security feature. Now, what is the security feature that everybody runs into and gets error messages about? I just see somebody's like, I was born in 2000. Yeah, yeah, sorry, I'm a few years ahead of you there. I was born in 76, but yeah.
Slightly older than me.
So yeah, back in the day, PHP had something called the secure mode, which means that it would only allow you to open files that had the same user ID as the PHP script you were reading. Oh, somebody's the same age as me. Yeah, that's nice. But yeah, the safe mode, especially in shared hosting environments, was really annoying because usually every script is an Apache user, so your access rights really got messed up. So I figured out in those days that it was annoying to actually look at the permissions of the file, and that in a shared hosting environment, people were usually restricted to their own home directory. So I actually wrote the function in PHP to, instead of checking for file permissions, it would actually limit you to the directory that you were allowed to use. So back in the day, I called it the open base dir restriction. In the meantime, the safe mode has been stripped out of PHP, but the open base dir restriction is still there. So if anybody ever ran into open base dir errors, that's my fault.
But you hear from what Sander's saying, he was solving a problem. You know, for me, when I started writing my initial code, I was also solving a problem. It was a very different one, though. I was solving the whoa, who's not muted? If you're not talking, please mute. Actually, I think I can. Yeah, I think Christian can mute people who aren't talking. I would say that for me, I was solving a different problem. I was solving the problem of the fact that I was bored stiff. And I was looking for ways to, you know, when you were interacting in this crowd on IRC where it was a very competitive environment and people were trying to do interesting things. So the first code that I ever wrote was written in Pascal. And I remember that my Pascal teacher, who was not the smartest woman on the planet, decided to announce that we could do our Pascal programs for the end of the year on anything, and it only had one restriction. It had to compile in the Pascal compiler. Now, has anybody here ever written any Pascal other than myself? Okay, so Sander, that's about it. But basically, Pascal had this really nifty feature where you could go program whatever, procedure whatever, semicolon, assembler, semicolon. and then write the
Yeah,
entire thing
I
in
was gonna say
assembler.
that yeah, I guessed at the moment you said it had to compile.
And so I wrote this end of year project, and it had no Pascal in it. It was written entirely in assembler. I did that because this teacher had told me anything that could compile in a Pascal compiler, and she'd kept telling people that she was smarter than everyone. So I figured that I'd prove that she wasn't. So I wrote this code, and it took me a long time to get the assembler right. Tom, please mute if you're not talking. I'm getting feedback there. But I wrote this in assembler, and what the teacher didn't know is there's another rule with code. Never run code that you can't read, ever. If you don't know what you're running, it's just a bad idea. And she ran this thing, and she ran it on the school server because I'd gone kind of byte direct code, which made it not work on a lot of the normal workstations. And what she didn't realize is that while it was scrolling pretty graphics around the screen, it was also picking sectors on her hard drive to zero out and making her machine less and less stable as I went. Because, well, that's what you do when you're an angry teenager. But I had to go and read. I had to learn. There was nobody who was going to teach me that. And it was a matter of experimenting. And I know that my home machine, I managed to forced myself into a position where I had to reinstall the machine I was writing this code on about 6 times because, well, it was designed to be nasty and I was being nasty to my own machine. And I learned this by chasing an objective. I wanted to achieve something that the teacher couldn't understand and that made her life hell. That was the objective. Now, some would say that's the wrong objective to have. The point is, it was an objective. I was chasing something. And then I kind of moved beyond Pascal and I started playing in C, and I discovered that in C, I had a lot more ability to do things in a lot faster way, but with the same level of power. Now, when I learned C, the first thing I did was I got the K&R book and I read it, and I spent a lot of time learning about pointers. Because one thing I'd learned from assembler is where stuff sits in memory, where it sits in the computer and how I access it through the interrupts or the memory or the registers or whatever was extremely important. So I started right down at the basics. Now, how many of you guys here code in C as a matter of interest? Anybody? No hands?
Let's do
Okay,
it on
only one.
the chat. Let's do it on chat, please. Those who are doing C.
Okay, so we've got 2 people who've said that they use C or C++. Now, let me ask those same people who've said yes, how well do you feel that you understand pointers? Well, not so well? Because I find an amazing amount of people who write in C, but will tell me that they don't understand pointers because it's something that kind of gets brushed over in the teaching. You can't brush over pointers in C because without understanding C and without understanding memory allocation, things are going to go wrong. Very, very, very wrong. And so you have to go back to those basics. Forget the 10,000 page long manuals when you're learning these languages. The K&R book, I think, is what, 200 pages long, Sander? Not can't be much longer than that. You must have used that book too. You know, it's a short book. And the reason that people get so confused with pointers is because people confuse it. They try and make this thing difficult. It's really actually not. It's simply a case of something points to this memory and you access the memory via a different path. And I can walk you through that on the chat or something in some more detail. But key to that is understanding where the memory in the computer is. Once you understand that, you build on it. all of your functions, your routines, your libraries, they all build from that base. And I had a question about which book, the K&R book, otherwise known as the C programming language, written by a guy called Kernighan and another guy called Ritchie. Ritchie was one of the guys who invented C. Kernighan was involved in writing both the C programming language, and he's actually just come out with the Go programming language as well. There we go. Okay, that's the Dutch version. It was translated into many languages. But it's a fairly short book. Why? Because it's teaching the fundamentals. It's not going into this complex base of this library does this and this library does that. It's about learning the fundamentals. And I would ask all of you guys who are coding, how many of you feel in your learning process that you were taught the fundamentals, and how many learned from, well, somebody referred to this library, referred to this library, referred to this library? There we go. It's 350 pages. It's longer than I thought, longer than I remember. I mean, how many of you, how much learning of fundamentals was there? Where the language came from? That's actually another interesting question. How many people know where C there we go. Christian, why are you muting me?
I'm trying to mute the chat. Oh my. Please, guys, mute your mics kindly.
I think that for a lot of people, even understanding where the languages came from, if you look at a language like Golang, Golang came out of a combination of Pascal. Christian, do you want to make me host here quickly, and then I can start muting people? Make me a
I've muted.
co-host.
I've muted.
Oh, there we go. You know, Golang came out of a set of 3 languages. There was C on the one side. There was Pascal, which had become Modular 2, which had become Oberon. And then there was another set of languages off to the side that was developed by Bell. And each of them introduced components that ended up in Golang as we know it today. You had the channelization stuff, which came out of, I think it's CSP or something. I can't remember what the name of the language train was. You had the packages and the modules, which came out of Pascal, followed by Modular 2, followed by Oberon. You had the C-style pointers and syntax, which came out of C. And all of those things contributed towards this language. Now, the guys who developed this obviously had a very fundamental grasp of programming at its base, because they managed to take the best elements of so many languages and combine them together. I have no doubts that in the future, somebody's going to come out with an even better language. I've yet to see it yet, but well, it will come. All of these languages, however, at the end of the day is just syntax. It really is, because it's about understanding the bits and bytes at the back end. And I would say to anybody who is learning to program, anybody who thinks they know how to program, if you can't explain to somebody how memory in a computer is addressed, if you can't explain to someone that a computer works in binary and everything is a manipulation of that, I would argue that you're not the programmer that you need to be. As good as you may be, you might be able to write loads of apps and lots of libraries. But that is where you need to start. You need to go back to basics. How does a computer work? The other thing is you need to forget about what people have told you is possible. There is no such thing as impossible. It's zeros and ones. And then you need to start playing. And if I look at a language like, the language that's taught me the most is actually Golang. And I'll tell you why, because I got to go back and look at how the language is written, because Golang is essentially written in Golang nowadays. And the entire code base is there to read. And when you start reading that code, you learn from it constantly. It's the same as when I use a library, I have a rule in my team, which I don't think is always followed, but I try and convince people to follow it. Don't use libraries you haven't read. If you're using a library, you need to understand what it's doing. You need to understand every line of that code. How many people ever read the libraries that they're using? Anybody? Anybody read the libraries that they're using? Say so in the chat. Okay.
So another interesting one that happens a lot in the JavaScript world with the Node.js. There's every so often there's a whole bunch of programs that break because one of their libraries suddenly disappears or breaks. And I've seen people actually use a library that consists of a single one-line function. And that's suddenly an external dependency their code has for just a single line of code.
Which doesn't make much sense because it creates a lack of stability, etc. But understanding those libraries is something that is, it will teach you things about code that you can't even begin to really explain. I mean, if I look at, one of the things that so many people are so afraid of in Golang is the unsafe library. Anybody who's written in Golang, how many people here have used the unsafe library?
I just pass it.
So here's something about the unsafe library. If you go and read half of Golang itself and their own libraries, the math library, the reflect library, even their strings library, it's got unsafe all over it. They call it unsafe because, yeah, it leaves you the option to shoot yourself in the foot, but there's a reason that they themselves use it, because it's fast. It gives you capability that may not otherwise exist. But you learn this by reading it. I use a lot of reflect in my code. It took me the better part of, a month to really understand reflect. Didn't understand reflect by reading, well, this is a definition of what this function does. I understood reflect by going back and putting in the time and the effort to go through reflect line by line by line by line. That's how you learn. And then you play. You know what I mean? So,
you know what the interesting thing is about the unsafe library? It's the only thing it signals is a shift of responsibility. If you at the moment you use unsafe, you take away the responsibility and tell the Golang, you don't have to worry about all the safety checks. I know what I'm doing. I will take care of it. And that's what makes it unsafe, because suddenly you're relying on the programmer. So the moment you use unsafe, you're explicitly telling the language, I will take responsibility and make sure this is done right. But yeah, you have to be able to take that responsibility.
And that's the next trick to mastering anything. You have to be willing to take responsibility for your code. You have to be willing to step outside of the box. You have to lose the fear that is imposed where people say, don't do this because, well, it's not good practice to do that. Well, guess what? Screw that. It is good practice to know how it works. And I know that many people were expecting me to come on here and show you lots of code. I'm not going to do that because I need you to understand that I can show you all the code in the world. But until you've got that mindset right, that you're going to chase the impossible, that you're going to play, that you're going to learn, that you're going to work at it, the code is going to mean nothing to you. You know, I could take you from the basics to the most complex code and ask Sander, I've written code that would really scare people. You know,
Yes.
but it's about a mentality. Don't wait for someone to teach it to you. You want to do something, you start and you go, well, this is what I want to achieve. And then you start writing. And if it doesn't work the first time, or you don't know how to do something, you get on Google, you pick up a book, you knock on someone's door and say, well, I'm trying to do this, but I have no idea how to accomplish it. And you play and you play and you play. When I am learning how to code something new, I can spend 18, 24, 48 hours in front of a keyboard at a time, testing, testing, testing until I get it right. Some of the time I never get it right. And I go, oh, well, at that point, I'll come back to that. But that's my message to all of you guys. You want to become a master of code. You start at the basics. You learn, how does a computer address memory? How does it work with shared memory? How do pointers work? How does binary work? And then you work from there on out, chasing objectives. And another thing that I do is, with all the projects I've got on the go, I always have one project on the back burner that I have no idea how to achieve. Always. That's my playtime code that I'm going to learn from. And when I achieve it, I find something else that I'm going to do. Always have something on the go that you do not know how to do, because that's how you're going to learn. If everything you do is everything you know how to do, you're not learning, you're not growing. Does that make sense to everybody?
I actually think you made a really nice point about the master bit, because if you're being a master at something, it means you're doing something that possibly nobody has done before. Otherwise, you're just following. And if you want to reach the point of being able to do what other people can't do, then you don't have other people to learn it from. You will have to work on that and investigate it yourself. There's nobody who can teach you how to be a master. Only, people can tell you how to think like a master, but the actual mastership has to come from within.
And there is another rule that people forget. The more you learn and the more you know, the more you will realize how little you know. It is fundamental to realize that there is always more out there. I'm good in Golang, but there's always someone better. But the thing is, I'm not prepared to accept the fact that I cannot be the best. So I am constantly chasing the unachievable. And so people go, well, why would you chase the unachievable? Because it's the only way to keep growing and keep learning. But if you think that you're going to learn by shortcuts, it doesn't work that way. You know, yeah, you can go and learn the basics of C and do some pretty powerful stuff in C in a week, you know, but you're not going to become a true master at it. That takes years of hard work, hard dedication. And it takes breaking a lot of the rules, because the rules out there are created by people. And I will say this, best practice is only best practice until somebody invents better practice. And Sandra and I have written some global best practice documents together. And I have a feeling that, you know, after certain changes that another friend of ours was pushing for in the IETF with the Slack stuff, some of what we wrote in that document may be antiquated, you know, if he gets the document through. It changes. So don't accept this argument that you can't do something because it's not best practice. It's best practice if it works for you and it produces the end result. Any thoughts on that
Interesting
statement?
thing is,
Sender?
I'll wait a bit, otherwise I'm always the first one to talk.
Guys, come on, thoughts.
I'll give it a start. So the things with best practices and things like that is you have to understand why they are best practices. Like there are things that are best practices because if you do it that way, there's the least chance of making a mistake. But it might not be the most performant way. And there's lots of things like that. Everything has meaning only in its context. It's a best practice in a certain context. If you have other requirements, it might not be the best anymore.
And that's the other thing. While I say to people, ignore the best practice, it's not saying don't learn what those best practices are. The point is to learn the best practice and then decide if it is applicable to you. You still have to learn what they are, because you learn things from people by understanding those. There were many of those things that I've seen and chosen, actively made a decision to go, this does not work for me. And then I discard it and come up with my own best practice. But I still make the point of learning those best practices. But anybody who comes
really
to me and says, oh yeah, go for it.
There's a really nice saying that says, rules are invented so that you think before you break them.
Exactly. Bend them, break them, whatever they are. But I would say that that's my message to all of you guys. Don't be afraid to go out and play. And by the way, you are capable of doing anything that I can do. I am not some super intelligent genius. I'm just a guy who has spent 29 years in front of a keyboard breaking the rules. That's all
Being
I am.
stubborn is a great benefit.
Yes, being stubborn as hell. Be stubborn, and have some belief in yourself. People say that I'm arrogant. I'm not arrogant. All I am is I have a supreme belief that given enough time, I can do anything. Because why should anybody else be able to do something that I can't? I'm a human with a brain. And so have some faith in yourselves, believe, play, and learn that way. That would be my message to you. And I really hope people have got something out of this, that you are capable of doing anything, but go back to basics. Forget the libraries, forget all of this is the shortcuts that they try and teach people in university so that they can churn out applications in 5 minutes, because they're not teaching you how to be a programmer at that point. They're teaching you how to churn out an application. If you want to be a programmer, you've got to go back to the basics. And, there are a lot of people out there who will help you along the way. Obviously, as I always say, when I find the time, I teach when I can. Obviously, I'm a very busy guy, so I don't always have the time to answer everything. And by the way, please don't phone me at midnight at night because your code's not working. I've had that happen because people have found my number on a WhatsApp group. Don't do that. You'll wake up my kid. But go back and play. That's my message to you. Be free with your code and learn to play. Forget the constraints. So, yeah. Comments, thoughts? Everybody, or have I shocked everybody into silence here? You can unmute and talk.
Guys, so actually Andrew have shared a lot together with Sander, and actually it's have been very much impactful for us, especially for those who are newbies. This is something that is very crucial for all of us. So actually, now I would like to welcome anybody with questions to Andrew, right? Yeah, you can ask some questions. Are you undergoing some challenges in code? Um, what is it that slugs you, so that you might get some insights. Yeah.
Feel free to unmute, use microphones, chat, whichever. And by the way, here's another rule, which one rule of life, which you cannot break. You cannot be afraid to ask questions. I learnt by banging on every door that I could find. I didn't care if the guy was a CEO, a CTO, the Queen of England. If they had something that I wanted, I banged on the door until I got it. If you're afraid to ask because you view somebody as above you, you're never going to get anywhere. People are people. They were all newbies at some point in their life. So ask. And there's no such thing as a stupid question. There's plenty of stupid answers. You're likely to get plenty of them from me. But there's no such thing as a stupid question. Now, that's an interesting question. What do you refer to as imposter syndrome?
Impression.
As to how to escape from tutorial purgatory, I read the tutorials only till the point where I can achieve something, and then I go back and I say, how do I do it better? And I will look at how to achieve something through a tutorial, but then I will ask how I.